Hey everyone, so it is an absolutely beautiful day in the garden today. So I figured I would sit outside and do a more relaxed video where I tell you all the mistakes I've made container gardening for the last few years and things I wish I would have done differently at the beginning so that hopefully you can avoid making these same mistakes, because the whole point of my channel is to help people learn about container gardening. And if I've already done things wrong, I'd rather you guys avoid having to do those things wrong as well. And then I figured I'd also kind of just do a little quick garden update because I do my monthly garden tours, but between April 1st and May 1st, a lot can change. So there's some things that are flowering now that maybe weren't in my April tour, just some update on some plants that I've gotten since then. So we'll do that at the end. Now, some of these will be quick because I do have more in-depth videos. So if I go in a topic about that, I'll link the videos down below that I have so you can watch those. But now I have my list here. So let's go ahead and go through the mistakes I've made that I'm hoping no one else has to make. And I'm going to start with kind of what could potentially be the most costly to the least costly or lower stakes mistakes. So first one is actually not a mistake. It's something I did correctly. All the rest, don't worry, are things I've done wrong. But the first category is to protect your deck. Now, obviously, if you're not gardening on a deck, this one won't apply to you. But if you're gardening on any sort of structure, just make sure you're protecting that structure so you don't have to pay to repair it. So the main thing, again, is deck capacity so that you're not overloading your deck with too much weight and it causes structural issues. This is definitely a topic I have a lot more in-depth videos on, so those will be linked down below. But then also you want to protect your deck from the containers you're using to garden. Specifically, the ones that come to mind are the grow bags for me, because all the other containers aren't as porous, but with a grow bag, because the material of the container itself does stay wet, it's like leaving a sponge on wood, which is not great. So I would put saucers, I would put wheeled caddies, I would put plant lifts, something underneath your containers, whether they are grow bags or not. I just think having that added layer of protection is good for your deck in the long run. Now, luckily, I haven't caused any terrible damage yet this way, but it's just something that I wish I would have done since year one instead of starting to get that done in year two. So I also have a video on that. I don't know if it's the same or separate videos as deck capacity, but that'll be linked down below. Now, let's go into raised or elevated beds, because these are containers that, at least for me, are probably the most expensive that I have in the garden just because they are larger. And if I'm going to invest money into a more expensive container, I want to make sure it's something that I truly love. Now, I do love the raised beds that I have. They work great. I just now notice some things that I wish I would have done differently beforehand as I've actually been using them in the garden. So the first thing is that I would stain my raised beds. Now, I could stain them now, and maybe I still might do that with some of them, but because I've kind of left them raw with cedar wood, which is what I use, you can't actually leave it raw, but I might have wanted to do a different color in my garden, and now I don't want a bunch of containers or raised beds that are different colors, so I'm kind of stuck with like the aged cedar, but I wish I would have done that differently at the beginning and picked a color that I liked. Second is that I wished I would have put wheels on my raised beds, either wheels or if I was going to have legs, look for legs that are metal. So wheels obviously make it easier to move around the deck, but it also lifts the wooden part of the elevated bed off your wooden deck. So I think all my raised beds have wooden legs. Wood sitting on wood, again, could potentially cause problems. So if I had either like metal protectors or metal legs on my beds, or even like plastic end caps on the legs, I think that would be better having that as the part that's touching my wooden deck versus just the wooden legs. Other things I would have done differently are look for raised beds that come with accessories, because now I know there's a whole world of accessories for your elevated beds. And when you get the bed that is made for the accessories, it's going to be a lot easier to find things that fit than trying to get something that fits your raised bed when it's not the same dimensions. So for example, I know that there are some raised beds that come with arches, supports, trellises, and I can still find those on my own. And I'm in the process of doing that. But again, if I had the raised bed that was made for those products, it'd be a lot easier. Also, something that I really want are little mini greenhouses for the top of my raised beds. Those do exist. I think the brands I found so far that kind of have either greenhouses or accessories. VegTrug, I know that has greenhouses that are made to fit the beds. I know that Cedar Planters has a greenhouse. And then most of the accessories I've seen are the raised beds from Gardener's Supply. So those are the brands that I think I'm going to be looking at in the future if I do expand my raised bed collection. But I don't want to get rid of the raised beds I have now, which work just fine, just to replace them with something that comes with arches or comes with a greenhouse. I'm going to try to DIY those myself at some point, whether this year or next year, that remains to be seen. But having that in mind ahead of time would have been great. But I didn't really garden much before I got my beds back in 2020, so I didn't know this. But hopefully, if that is something and you maybe haven't invested in your larger elevated or raised beds, think of all of the other options you might use with those beds and see if that is available from where you're purchasing, that it does have those accessories included. Again, nothing that's necessary, just something that would have been nice to do. So now let's move on to pots. Obviously, most pots shouldn't be as expensive as your raised beds unless you're getting a very expensive or potentially a very large pot. But when I first started gardening, I got pots that I thought were pretty, and that was basically my only qualification of something is, oh, I think that's pretty, I'm going to get it. Now, I don't necessarily go for looks of the pot. I go for more of like the usability of it on my deck. So when I was getting pots that I thought were pretty, I often went towards ceramic pots, large pots with really pretty designs. And there were a few issues with those. One, they're heavy. So if I'm carrying them not only up to the deck, but also then trying to move them around the deck, it was very difficult, especially after they were filled with soil and plants. Also, a lot of those ceramic pots don't overwinter well outside. They can potentially crack, and there really wasn't room inside for me to store all of those pots. So I've gone away from that. I still use them for houseplants because, I mean, it's inside over winter and they're not really moving very far, but I do put them on wheeled caddies now so I can push the houseplants around if I need to. But now what I look for out here on my deck is, one, I make sure I'm getting the right size for the plants. So oftentimes I will have a plant first, and then if I don't have a pot that's the right size, I'll go and hunt of the pot specifically for that plant. Second, I go for lightweight because I, one, don't want to add too much additional weight to the deck, especially for larger containers, and I want to be able to move them around, or some of my perennials get carried down to the garage. So I don't want to have a very heavy pot that would make that almost impossible. So now I lean towards things like resin, and that's great because those can also be stored outside just fine and they won't crack. So resin pots, plastic pots, any material that's going to be easy for me to carry around, because again, the plants and the soil are going to add more weight to the pot. And then I've also just found, and this is more of a personal aesthetic choice, is that now I go for more like neutral kind of bland pots, because the plants themselves are really the star of the show. And for me, it almost feels too busy if I have a bunch of different colors of pots or pots with a lot of busy designs and then all of my colorful flowers. Although I have seen this done really well elsewhere. There's a really pretty parkway. I don't think I have a photo. If I do, I'll pop it in. But there's a really pretty parkway that has like beautifully decorated pots with flowers inside. But for me in my garden, I like my containers to be neutral and not stand out. And then that way the plants themselves can stand out. So that's what I've realized now with containers. I go, again, more for usability, durability, weight, all of those versus how pretty do they look. I mean, I still get pots that I think look nice enough, but that's like the lowest on my list of qualifications. Now let's move into the plants themselves. First is not reading instructions. I've never been a person that's great at reading instructions. I still remember there was a test we took, I think, in middle school, and the first line of instruction said, read all the instructions before you do anything else. And then it kind of went through a list of things you're supposed to do. And the very last step was, don't do anything except for sign your name on this paper. So that was a lesson for me because I did not do it. I started working through it to read everything through. But it's so important, not only for your plants, but also for like any fertilizers you're applying to your plants. read the instructions, follow the instructions. That way you can tell if you are growing marigolds that are 5 feet tall versus thinking you're growing marigolds that are about a foot tall. But read all the information that you have on anything that you're using in your garden before you actually use it. And now I even take notes in Google Drive and Google Excel spreadsheets just so I can quickly reference the most important information from all of the instructions. Next is not being able to let go of plants. This is still very difficult for me, but I've learned over the last few years how important it really is. So first of all, I don't have a ton of space. So when I can't get rid of plants, I then cram them together, either way too close in my elevated beds, or I just throw them in random pots, and then those pots usually are like the smaller ones I have left over. It makes more things for me to water, and I don't really love that I have to have that added maintenance. I just couldn't let go of that plant. But I do know that for the overall health and growth of my plants, it is best to limit. I say limit. It's not like I have only 5 plants, but to kind of pare down what I have in my garden so that the plants I do keep have enough space to grow. So this includes like when I'm thinning my seedlings, if I've just started too many, more than I have room for, I'm now better at giving them away to other people. And giving them away also makes me feel better than just like tossing them in my composter, so that I know they're going to someone else who will use them. But I know it's very hard. So if you can't get rid of plants, just know that your garden will be better off for it if you do have adequate spacing and you're not just throwing a bunch of plants in there and then causing issues. Now, I do still shave off a few inches with spacing. It's not like if something, let's say, says 8 inches, I might shave off a couple and do 6 inches, but there were times when I was going from like 8 inches to 2 inches, and that was not great. And it also made me think I didn't like some plants that I actually grew to like. So the first time I grew China asters, I did not give them barely any room. Not surprisingly, they didn't perform well. So I thought I didn't like China asters until last year I grew a bunch of varieties, gave them adequate space, and now they're one of my must-have flowers. So it's hard, but I promise you can do it and you'll be much happier off. And then kind of going off of not being able to get rid of plants, it was also very hard for me to say no to plants. Whether it was seeds someone was giving me, whether it was plants I saw at a garden center, I would get so excited to just try something out, which I think is still a fun and important part of gardening. But as I've realized over the last few years what I truly love, what I truly use, I'm decreasing the amount of different plants I have, and I'm growing more varieties, for example, of zinnias, because I know I really love zinnias in my garden. So when you have limited space, you do have to make tougher choices about what you're going to allow into your garden and what you're not going to allow into your garden. Like, for example, I have grown eggplants. I still like growing eggplants. I don't really eat eggplant very often, so it's not worth it to take up the limited space that I have for something that I don't really enjoy that much or eat that often. So I would rather save that space for things like tomatoes or zucchinis or cucumber that I know I am going to use throughout the season. Another mistake was to use the cheapest potting soil available. Now, I will say I've used a lot of different potting soil brands, and I've gotten potting soil from Home Depot, I've gotten potting soil online, I've gotten potting soil from local garden centers, and all of them except the one brand I'm thinking of have been just fine. But I do believe now that quality of the potting soil is much more important than the price and the quantity that you can get. Potting soil is also a pretty big expense in my garden. That and the containers I think are probably the 2 most expensive parts of my container garden. And I need a lot of bags to fill up all of the containers that I have. So last year or the year before, I went to Home Depot and there was a sale on Vigoro, so I got maybe 8 to 10 bags. And that's another thing. If you're trying a new brand for the first time, I would just get 1 bag and try it out before you go back and invest in a lot more bags. But I filled one of my containers with it and it felt very clay-like. I also found some random items in it, like old plant tags. So from an unopened bag of potting soil, there was a pepper plant tag. It was not from my pepper plant. I found like plant twist ties. So clearly the soil had been through a lot. And I could tell the texture was off, but because I already had all these bags, I used it anyway. And I wish I hadn't, because The plants that I planted in the containers using that soil did not do well. One container, because it was smaller, everything kept dying completely and I had to go in and amend it. So from that, I have personally found that the best quality soil is from the local garden center. So whatever garden centers are around you, I would purchase potting soil from them. A lot of my garden centers even have like their own branded potting soil. And that's also usually where I get my compost from as well, because I have a tumbler composter, but it's not big enough to make compost for my entire garden. So it's not like you have to spend $30 per bag of potting soil, but like maybe you want to choose the one that's $8 versus the one that's $5. But start with one bag, see if you like it, see how the quality is, and if you find random things in your potting soil bag, you should probably go back to the store and tell them instead of trying to use it in your garden. Oh, hello pigeon. Next is something that's going to be very environmentally specific to like my climate, which is very wet and humid, and I have had issues, which I'm sure you know if you've been here for a while, with root rot and bulb rot in my garden. In fact, that is what has killed most of the plants in my garden. It's not the cold weather, it's not pests, it's the amount of moisture, usually late winter, early spring, that we get with the rain, but then we have cool temperatures. So the water is not evaporating from the soil and all my plants are basically sitting in soggy soil. So I've realized I need to cover my plants for sure in the winter. So I tarp my beds with the bulbs. I bring more into my garage, or I'm going to use again this coming fall a greenhouse, like a little plastic greenhouse that doesn't let any moisture in, because I just cannot leave the majority. There's a few plants in larger pots that are fine, but the majority of my plants I cannot leave out. And I've realized over the years I need to keep them inside longer, because I'll get excited that temperatures are warming up into like the 40s or 50s, and I'll push my plants outside, and then again we get those rains and that cool weather and it causes them to die. So for me, again, here in Chicago with my container garden, I can't leave plants out whereas I probably could, even if I was in a similar zone 6A, similar average temperatures, but it was dry instead of humid. I think I'd be able to leave a lot more out. Like I know some people that are fine leaving their bulbs out because they don't get so much moisture. So that is just something that, again, if you don't have a covered area, maybe moving them inside to a garage or somewhere where you can keep them protected, a shed, if you do get a lot of moisture, because it's wiped out so many plants. I think it's also caused a lot of fungal issues with some of my plants as well. So if you are in a similar climate, keep that in mind, that you're probably going to have to cover or keep your pots somewhere where they're not exposed to the elements in the winter and in the early spring. All right, so now that I've gone over some of the mistakes that I've made, let me take you around and just give you a little quick update on how things are doing in my garden. We're on the back deck and I have all of my spring bulbs out, and then also I have outside my hydrangeas and my apple trees. Now I think, at least for now, these will stay outside. So the hydrangeas overwintered in the garage. I have been bringing them in and out. Well, two of them, can't remember which two now, I brought inside super early because they had started to leaf out. Maybe it was these two, since this one already has a lot of flowers on it. And I started them inside in February because I was bored, and I've been letting them grow in there. And then as the weather's gotten warmer, I've been moving them inside and outside. So for now, our nights are still above 45, which I'm comfortable leaving them out in that weather. But if it gets colder than that, I am going to continue to bring them inside overnight. One great thing about container gardening. I also want to just show off, even though I'm pretty sure I already showed these off, these wild tulips that I got from Gethsemane in the fall. Planted them then, and look how pretty. Now some bulbs have rotted in here, but these have not. I'm going to move these down to the parkway after they're done blooming, and they're also supposed to multiply, so I'm hoping that works out well. Now I also added in some pansies because I was feeling bad about some of the bulbs that rotted, so I added those in, but then harvested some of the flowers to press. But they'll bloom again and add more color to my garden. I think that's really the only updates that I have back here, but I do have some new plants out on the front deck. Out on the front deck now, and there were just 2 butterflies flying around. I'm hoping they come back. So not too many updates except for some of these plants right here in this row. So first off, I got a hardy fig. This is the Chicago hardy fig, because if I'm going to grow one, it has to be the one called Chicago. It's just barely, so I got this in the mail. Basically, when you order plants, typically you'll order them ahead of time and they'll ship when they're actually ready to be outside. I'm still keeping an eye on this. Similar to the hydrangeas, because this is a younger plant, I am fine with it above 40 degrees. If we get any freezing cold temps, I will move it inside just to be safe. But there are some buds starting to form there. Down here is another new plant. This is a strawberry mint plant that I also got from Stark Bros. Now, I have a whole mint orchard that I'm going to grow. I ordered 5 or 6 different other fruit mint flavors or fruit mint flavored plants from Mountain Growers, I think is what it was called. Those aren't going to be here until I think May. So this right now is the only mint I have. And the same thing with mint, I'll keep it out in nights that are above 40. I have my cantaloupe and my zinnia that I started back in February for MeTV and couldn't get rid of. These I'm just bringing outside for the day. I wouldn't leave these outside with nighttime temps below 50 or like 55, which is where we're still at. So these are just getting sun now because it's like 65 degrees and beautiful. And then I also have a mini peach tree. Let me see what this one was, because I don't remember off the top of my head. This is the Honey Babe miniature peach. The 2 fruit trees I just repotted into larger nursery pots because I don't know exactly where these are going to go yet or what pot they're going to go in. So they're just in those nursery pots for now. So that's everything for this video. Just sharing some of my mistakes and a little quick garden update. If you've made mistakes that you think other people can learn from, whether it's container gardening specific or not, leave them down below so that hopefully we can maybe avoid those as well. But thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.